Welcome to Whisky.com, where fine spirits meet. My name is Luening, Horst Luening, and I'm the master taster of Whisky.com. And today we ask ourselves the question how to find a full-bodied single malt Scotch whisky. That's not too easy. In former times, people asked for mild and mellow, and then they added a lot of ice to the whisky. You remember Dallas, the television series where Larry Hagman came to the South Fork Ranch and then he poured a generous dram of whiskey, added several cubes of ice, so the whiskey was completely close to frozen, and then he swallowed it as a full. And this showed there was no intention for having a smell, a taste, for sipping. No. The intention was to have an outcome. Yes, the alcohol in the whiskey. So whiskey was American or English, no, British, no, Scottish. So the United Kingdom was whiskey, and vodka, which is far less intense, which is close to pure alcohol, was Russia. So everybody said, well, I want to have a alcohol drink without any taste, but I avoid vodka. No, please have an American whiskey or imperial whiskey. Just a joke. You smell 1,000 times more than you taste. The taste buds on your tongue, they are, well, you have inherited the taste buds, and childs are already able to taste with the tongue to figure out if something is sweet or bitter, sour. And umami, this is proteins, meat. So childs are already able, very young childs are already able to taste these aromas or tastes on the tongue, but smelling is very different. Smelling, you have your receptors in the nose and at the roof of your mouth, and from there the nerves are going through your skull into the brain, and they concentrate in the olfactory center of your brain. And there is, in the beginning of your life, nothing. So you have to learn tastes. So as a child, I was taken to the zoo and there to the lion's cage, and it was an awful smell. So I remember this smell very, very much, and whenever I enter a zoo, I can tell you where the lions are. So I do not like this smell at all. It's awful. It's wow. So you learn it, and so you also learn the taste of whiskeys, the aromas inside whiskey. So, and if you have a ice-cold liquid, you aren't able to smell anything, because it's a physical law that by reducing the temperature, there are less molecules leaving the liquid and will impact your nose. So a very cold liquid tastes close to nothing. So take an ice cold beer. Every beer tastes nearly the same. If you have a small craft beer, you drink it far more or warmer than those beers you drink to television. Yeah. How to find out how intense whiskey is? At first, I want to tell you about the whiskey database inside Whisky.com. There's a blue register where we added our whiskey database, and inside this database you find thousands of bottles and thousands of pictures of bottles and of distilleries. We visited nearly all. I'm missing 5 or 7 distilleries in Scotland. Pictures of those distilleries, mostly with the stills of the distillery, and by looking at the stills you look at the, you search for the distillery, and then you receive a map, and there's a link on the map. You click in this map, and then you get the page of the distillery, and there are pictures on top where you can scroll through, and somewhere you find also the pictures of the stills. And by the stills you can decide if this whiskey is more intense or less intense. I will show you soon. The first impact on the taste of a whiskey is the distillation. Distillation takes place in those pot stills. Typically you have, for single malt whiskey in Scotland, double distillation. And the more often you distill, there are some distilleries out there with 3 pot stills. The more you distill, the smoother the whiskey becomes, the less flavors are driven over to the final product, to the raw whiskey, the more of the flavors are left behind. And if you distill extremely, then you end up in vodka from cereals. So you would like to have also the very light aromas in a whiskey, but not the faints, the sharp ones, no, but the light ones like citrus or apples or something like this. Then you will have the full medium middle cut of the whiskey, and then there's the pot ale, the residue of distillation. And now you have to decide how much of the oils from the pot ale you would like to drive over with the distillation. If you carry too many, then it's bitter and you will have a headache and whatever, those fusel oils. But if you take a few of them with you to the final product, then you have more aromatic aromas in your whiskey, more substances which carry aromas. So 3 times distillation. I have here a picture of Auchentoshan. Will not lead to full bodies whiskey. There are Auchentoshan whiskies like the 3-wood, which are quite intense, but this is done through maturation. This is a different tale. We are still at the distillation stage. And during this distillation, if you distill 3 times, then the whiskey will become mild and mellow. This is not what we are looking for. In the moment, we are looking for a full-bodied and full intense whiskey. Then the second thing is, if you distill twice but have very tall stills, like the tallest stills in Scotland, which Glenmorangie has. Here are the pictures of these tall, very tall and slim and narrow stills. Then the fumes of the distillation, the alcohol, water and aroma fumes will divide very perfectly in this long column of fumes. And then the result will be very smooth, not that full-bodied, full-laden. So 3 times distillation isn't that good for a full-bodied whiskey. The same effect have reflux bowls. What is this? If you distill the wash in a pot still, then the fumes rise and then they condense at the copper of the long tall neck and they flow back into the liquid again. This is called the reflux. Then you heat up the system and heat up the system, and then the reflux moves up to the top until the first fumes go over into the line arm and are received in the spirit receiver. And by adding additional surface to this long tall neck, it's called reflux bowls, you do not have the slim and narrow neck, but you have a bowl in it. So the surface is bigger. There you have more cooling of the surrounding air, more reflux, it's called a reflux bowl, and a smoother whiskey. So whenever you see reflux bowls in a still, might not be the most intense whiskey we are looking for. So look at the Glenmorangie stills. They have 6 meters height. This is 20 feet. They are the highest in Scotland, and they have reflux bowls. So the result is a very, very smooth whiskey. Okay, but there's also the possibility you have these pots, then you have a lid on the pot, and then the junction to the neck, how this junction is done. If this is very, very narrow and then opens again for a taller neck, then the boiling liquid, the boiling wash in the pot still is separated from the fumes in the neck of the still. So this separation will also result in an undisturbed column of alcohol, water, fumes, and this will lead to a better distillation, less aromas in the whiskey. Full-bodied whiskies result from pot stills which look like pears. Here we have a picture from Lagavulin, and here you can see everything you're eating up in the pot still will move over to the final product. So this is the reason why Lagavulin is such an intense single malt whiskey, because everything from the light foreshots to the intense oils after the middle cut, everything is moved over, and it's very critical when you start collecting the heart, when you are stopping the heart, because if you stop a little bit too late, then headache or very sharp fumes from the foreshots will move into the final spirit. Therefore, Lagavulin is 16 years old, and during this maturation period, those sharp aromas are converted into more complex aromas. So perhaps Lagavulin needs those 16 years. Yeah. The second influence is the peat smoke in a whiskey. Some people do not like the peat smoke at all, so avoid those whiskies. But adding more aromas to a whiskey means also adding peat smoke to a whiskey. And this results typically in more intense whiskies. I show you a picture of the kiln of Lafroig, where you can see the black bricks of peat where they smoke. The phenols are generated, and those are moved onto the barley and through the distillation into the raw whiskey and into the cask. And inside the cask, there's more going on, and this is the third influence, where you can have a full-bodied or a smooth whiskey. There are two kinds of maturation. The first is the subtraction of sharp, unripe, young aromas. So this happens also in steel tanks. You just have to wait, and then chemistry is going on in this liquid, and there is some oxidization going on, and those sharp, fresh aromas move over to, yes, older, darker aromas. Why dark? If you have a full oxidized, dry plum, this is for me a dark aroma. You can see this fruit is dark, it's oxidized fully. And a fresh green apple, this is fresh, this is unoxidized. And if you leave this apple after a bite, it takes quite a time, then it becomes darker. Oxidization is taking place. So this is subtraction of unripe, of sharp aromas in a whiskey. It is in a cask, and the cask is made from oak, and there are a porous structure in the staves of the cask, so oxygen from the outside moves in and out through temperature changes, so the cask breathes, presses out in summer and contracts the liquid in and tears fresh oxygen into the cask, and then oxidization takes place faster. The longer you have this subtractive maturation, the more the spirit loses its distillery character. And if you have a very, very old whiskey, then it's quite difficult to find out which whiskey belongs to which distillery. It's always very difficult, but the older whiskey becomes, the more difficult it gets. If you have peat smoke, then you have not fully oxidized aromas, those phenols in the whiskey, and then oxidization takes place on those not oxidized aromas, and this will lead to more complex aromas. So if you have a peated whiskey which matures for years and years, then it adds up more complex aromas. So an old peated whiskey is typically more complex and has more aromas than a young peated whiskey, because those thousands of different aromas resulting from this incomplete combustion of the peat, this is what brings the complexity in those old peaty whiskies. And old whiskies itself taste quite the same. Oh, this is a little bit overstated, but they narrow, the gap is narrowing. If you have old sherry cask whiskies like a Glengrant or a Strathyla, then the result of these 40 years of maturation is quite the same. I find it very difficult to distinguish differences between those old whiskies if they are matured in the same way in comparable casks. And here we have the we have the second influence during maturation. This is additional maturation, where you add aromas to the whiskey. The first is subtraction. You reduce aromas by time, by oxidization. And the second is you add aromas from the cask itself, from the oak wood. And if you have American oak, the species of American, Quercus alba, then the aromas are quite not that strong. They are fine, elegant. But if you have European oak, then the character of the oak is intense. So if you have French limousine casks, it's impacting. And having 20 years of maturation in a first fill cask of European oak, this is quite heavy. Not all people like those heavy oak aromas, which tend to be bitter. And if the cask had an intense liquid in it before, like a French wine, a Spanish sherry, Portuguese port wine, then the aromas from the wine also go over into the whiskey. So it's not only the oak wood of the European oak, but it's also the liquid which stayed before in this cask. So you can build up aromas in a whiskey by the distillation. Avoid those perfect distillations. Then add smoke through peat smoke. Then do not mature too long, that the subtraction maturation does not take place too much. Then add fresh casks which carried an intense liquid before. So these are the impacts for a full-bodied single malt Scotch whiskies. And if you have a look at those sample bottles I have here, you see these Tullibardine whiskey. It carries no age statement on it, so there is. It might be quite young, 3 to 5 years, I suggest. It's quite dark because it matured in a fresh Burgundy red wine cask. And therefore, people like these whiskies because they are so intense. They are so full laden of aromas. And they are willing to pay a lot of money for these whiskies without an age statement on it because they are so intense. This is the people are looking for. The Talisker whiskey, the next one, is matured in Amoroso sherry casks, and the Talisker whiskey has a distillery character which is quite sharp, quite spicy, intense. And the sherry cask maturation finishing adds a lot of fruit aromas and oak aromas into this whiskey, so they complete, and you have a little smokiness in the whiskey, so it's full laden, full aromatic. There's the Abelauer whiskey over there. Highland whiskey, Speyside, might not be that intense. On one side you have a cask strength, so there's more power in the whiskey itself, but you have to be careful. More alcohol does not always mean more aroma, more full body. It could mean too sharp. So you have to add a splash of water to reduce the whiskey a little bit to a drinking strength, and then typically more aromas leave the whiskey because the alcohol has a solution capability, and this is reduced if we reduce the strength, and then aromas leave the whiskey and you have more aromas. But the Abelauer whiskey, I have a picture of the stills here, come from pear-shaped stills. So there's more intensity in those whiskies. And the Lefroy is very smooth whiskey, as I said and showed in the beginning with the Lefroy picture of the stills. They have a very narrow neck at the stills, so the whiskey itself, the distillery character, is very smooth, but they fill in a lot of peat smoke and they add a lot of oak during the maturation. These small quarter casks, those sherry casks behind as the final maturation period. So they add a lot of aromas in this whiskey. But there's also a question how fast a whiskey is distilled. If the pear-shaped stills are heated slowly, then the outcome might be not that intense. So you have to look at the stills and then you have to decide, well, does the character meet the expectations of the stills? This influence of time you're not able to find out very well. And there's an indication if the still is very dark, then the still is heated and is rushed during the distillation, then the whiskey might be more intense than the whiskey is out from bright shining copper stills, but those bright shining copper stills might only be new. You can't tell exactly. I think this was it for now. There's more to come. Stay tuned. And hopefully you find your full-bodied and intense single malt Scotch whisky. Thank you for watching.